welcome to another video. In this video, I would like to discuss a matter of holiness, which is as a result of this upcoming morning, which is the resurrection of Christ. In the resurrection of Christ, we now see the Shroud of Turin, which is believed to be what was Christ wrapped once he was laid to rest. In 1988, scientists performed tests and they found levels of radiation, which when they scan the levels of radiation, they actually see that it creates an image of a man believed to be Jesus of Nazareth. But how would one know for sure that that is particularly Jesus's Shroud of Turin, his cloth? Well, for one, we can actually see the pattern of that story, if you wish. If we go back to Jesus's birth, 33 years prior, we now see that when the three kings arrived to Jesus's birth, which they were actually fleeing from being banished from King Herod's kingdom. And in King Herod's kingdom is where we see the rise of David and the fall of Goliath. This is the era that which you see the three kings stem from, which is exactly that particular battle, which King Herod loses. And now you see that these three king mages, les trois rois mages, the three king mages, which are traveling through the darkness of the night, arrive upon a small pasture where a child is born, and his name is Jesus. And the first things that these three kings do is they give Jesus three offerings. Now this is a foreshadowing, you see, because in the offerings, if you were to analyze now any particular time in any other culture where you see an offering being gifted to a child, to a virgin, to an individual of innocence, anytime you see an offering being given to a particular innocence in other cultures, it was meant to act as a sacrificial ceremonial rite of passage. But what were the three gifts that which were the three kings that gifted to Jesus? Well, for one, they were myrrh, frankincense, and gold. Now, what are these three things? Well, myrrh and frankincense are actually an antibacterial and anti-inflammatory, as well as a painkiller. These two ingredients, myrrh and frankincense, are actually embalming creams, which was what Jesus was gifted. He was gifted embalming creams. He was gifted myrrh and frankincense, which now when you look at the Shroud of Turin, what was he embalmed with? It was specifically the Shroud of Turin. And so now when you look at the Shroud of Turin, how do we know for sure that is in fact the Shroud of Turin that which Jesus wore at the time he was laid to rest? Well, for one, you could actually test for levels of myrrh and frankincense inside the cloth, but that would also require to touch a holy object, which, as some of you may begin to understand now, that the battle of divinity or the understanding of divinity is as a result of a sacrifice of your mental health, which now when you take on a experience of divinity, also known as psychosis, the beginning of spirituality, where you don't begin at the light, no. You begin in the darkness so that you may work towards the light. And the idea of spirituality, a lot of people think that spirituality is supposed to be oh so beautiful, oh so positive, and have zero negativity. That's what most people believe being spiritual means. It means having no negativity. But that is a false concept to a certain degree, because see, if understanding spirituality and the Holy Spirit, that which binds us all into one, if binding us all into one requires the Holy Spirit, that doesn't just bind us in bodies, that binds us in mental and physical and spiritual energies, which means if you look at good and evil, you now have to combine both of these forces together to make one particular experience known as a human. That is what makes us human. We are a divine being, which we actively act out of instinct, whether we like to admit it or not. But as humans, it is very quick for us now to return back to our animalistic selves the moment we experience a trigger point. But see, in the story of Christ, the real trigger wasn't for the fact that the moment Christ was crucified, the world essentially said there is no room for God in the world. And from this moment forth, there shall be no room for God in the world, because we see it even in the holiest of the last few religions. Because you see, from the moment of faith that Jesus created, he then stimulated Catholicism, also known as worshipping within a cathedral, where you will find your salvation in your suffering. And then from there was also the split between, you could say, Protestants and Catholics at the initial time. Because you see, a true Protestant is what is a Christian. Someone that said, I don't agree with the idea that in order to be given salvation, I now have to stay in my suffering. Protestants of ancient times were the true forefathers of Christianity in that sense, because they argued that the true salvation of man is not in the suffering, but in the rebirth of the man. Which is what the Shroud of Turin represents for Christians. The Shroud of Turin represents the rebirth, which is the moment that Christ found his salvation. What does it mean, salvation? Finding salvation could be said essentially you are found innocent. And in your salvation, you could essentially say that when you're faced in front of the angel Michael and he asks you, are you light enough to enter? Depending on how the scales tipped in your favor, are you light enough? Is your soul light enough to enter heaven? If it was easy, everybody would get there. The idea is the road is a hard path because very few actually make it. In order to make it, you can't expect to hold back yourself for the rest of the world. You have to give the world your full potential, which few are willing to do. But Christ was a man that gave his full potential. Christ was not just a man that gave his full potential. He also gave the world a momentum of faith. Because now, through the teachings of Christ, which we understand can be either seen as a prince from India or a Persian man from Iraq, and other traces indicate that the Shroud of Turin may have come from the further Eastern Kingdom. Now when you look at the stories of Siddhartha, such as Buddha, where you now see a young prince who, in exchange for wanting to learn about the world, he would ask his father to remove his innocence for him by allowing him to venture off into the garden, which in three different visits, Siddhartha, the first visit, he stepped out into the world young, and he saw a man that was sick, and he wondered, why is that man sick? Why is that man sick? And it frightened him, and he went back into the walls of the garden of his father's kingdom. The second time he ventured out, he saw that a man was old, and he wondered, why is a man old? And it frightened him, and he ventured back into the gate of the garden. And the third time he ventured out, Buddha saw a man that was dead, and he wondered, why does a man die? And it frightened him, and he went back into the garden housed by his father's kingdom. But now you see in the question and the story itself, you now see the answer. When man is sick, he gets old and he dies. But what happens when he dies? Well, a man returns to the garden within his father's kingdom. Anyways, folks, I hope that was a thing that you might have found a moment in your own faith. And I'm here to teach that there's not just one beauty in one particular faith, that which we as humans think now we are born into only being able to worship in one particular way, which is according to the religion you stem and are born from. But you see, folks, the idea of religion indicates one particular thing, which is the moment you awaken the story, according to the symbol you place upon yourself, you then begin living that story. You see, a religion is an incantation, it is an invocation, where you are actively invoking that particular individual's life to be the story you follow in, which means as the shepherd, you are now following in the footsteps of he who guides you towards your salvation. And that is the moment you discover Christ. For me it was. Anyways, folks, thank you for watching.